And now we're going to start with lesson 9, and much like the beginning of the book where we started with an editing quick start, we start off the color chapters with a color quick start. So lesson 9 is a color quick start. It's a short lesson where we just really take people through the user interface and the buttons they'll click just to get them used to the tools. It's not everything we do will be repeated in the other lessons, so it's not super critical that they understand exactly what we're doing as long as they feel comfortable in the user interface and how to move around the tools. So to begin with, what we do is we switch from this project, Age of Airplanes, and we move to a different project. And so we'll go up to the File menu, and we'll choose the Project Manager. And this project that we import is actually an archive. So we talk about archives here, where we'll talk about right-clicking and choosing Restore, and we'll talk about how Resolve has this function of an archive. We don't have to go too deep into it because we do cover it in lesson 14 or 15, actually, where we cover media management and archive and restore. So we're talking about restore here, and we go into our documents folder in R14 lessons. This is lesson 9. You'll see this citizen chain cyclery.dra, which we're going to open up, and here it is here. We'll double click, we'll open it. Now when you open it, it's going to still be in the Fairlight page because that's where we left off with lesson 8. So what we're going to do is switch back to the edit page, come up to our workspace, and just reset the user interface layout. Now this is your edit timeline. It looks familiar. To go into color grading, all you have to do is click it. So we're not dealing with an XML or coming from a different system. We've edited this inside of Resolve, so it's very easy to move forward here and just start going into color grading. And you talk about, this is the first time people are going to really see the color grading interface, so you want to definitely make sure that you give them an overview, with this being the viewer in the timeline, and that you can click on thumbnails and just quickly move. Brings you to the first frame of the clip that you click on. You have a little mini timeline down here that you can scrub through. Down the bottom of are your color correction controls. There's a toolbar in the middle. You have a keyframe editor, but you also have scopes along the side here. And you have your stills gallery over on the left of the viewer, and your node editor, and you can talk about those very briefly since we do go into them in much greater detail over the next 3 or 4 lessons. Okay, you definitely want to point out though that when you switch from the edit page to the color page, nothing happens to the timeline, right? It may look different, but all the edits are still in place and all the edits act the same. So nothing happens to your timeline. It's just a different view. You want to make sure that people understand that. And the first thing that we do is we just talk about how underneath each thumbnail is the codec, but you can double click that and it then gives you the clip names. So it's just an easy way to view your clip names. And if we want to start color grading, we pick a clip. We're going to start with maybe this last clip in the timeline. And let's say that we want to start color grading. Well, you have these primaries controls down here in the lower left. You have wheels. You want to explain that these are separated into lift, gamma, and gain. And lift, gamma, and gain are equivalent to the darkest areas, the lightest areas, and your midtones. And the wheels are going to adjust your hue and tint and saturation of these regions, and underneath that the master wheels are going to make tonal changes, the blacks, the midtones, and your highlights. So if we wanted to do something like make bluer shadows, we would come over to lift because that's the shadow area, and we would drag this color indicator towards blue, and you can see in our viewer how the darker areas turn to blue. And the master wheel, if we wanted to make things darker, the master wheel dragging that to the left would bring things darker, or to the right would bring things brighter. So you're just getting people to understand how these tools work. You're not really doing anything specific with them. And you would do the same thing for gamma and gain. You would say, oh, in the gain, if we wanted to make this a little bit more warmer, in the highlights we would push this towards orange, and if we wanted them to be brighter we would drag it up, or darker we would drag the master wheel down. Again, just showing them these two different tools And same thing for master wheel. You know, if we wanted to make this a little bit more magenta in the midtones, we would drag it off to magenta. And if we wanted to brighten things up or darken things up in the midtones, we would just drag this either way. So just give them a feel for all of that. And then once they do it, you definitely want to show now how to get back to their untouched image, right? Their original image. So you can say we're going to go up to the view menu and we're going to bypass all the grades, which is Shift D. So now here's the original image. We'll go back up, bypass all grades. Here's your corrected image. Now if you don't like any of those, maybe we don't like the magenta, you have these little round circles and these show up everywhere in Resolve. These are reset buttons. So if I just want to reset the gamma, I can just click on that. Or all the way over in the primaries wheels, up in the upper right hand corner, there's a reset button for the entire palette. So we can just click it and now we're back to normal. There are other primary controls, so let's go to a different clip. For this one we go to clip 3 and we talk about these adjustments that are below here. These are other primary tools that people can use. And we talk about if we want to adjust something like contrast, these are infinite sliders down here. You just hover your mouse over the value there and you can drag to the right to increase the contrast or to the left to decrease it. And we're just going to move that just a little bit, maybe to like 1.2 or something like that, just to make it good and crunchy there. There are 2 pages of these, and these are 1 and 2 right here. So if you want to click to another page of primary controls down here, shared adjustments, that's what they're called, adjustments. You can click on that and you have temperature and tint and something like color boost. So if we wanted to increase the color boost, which is going to increase the saturation of low saturated colors. So your tans and your brown, your natural tones, those are going to get a bigger boost than say your blues and reds, which are going to get less of a boost. So unlike saturation that boosts everything, color boost is selective boosting of saturation of unsaturated colors, so to speak. And then you have something like shadows. You know, if you want to boost the shadows or decrease the shadow, you have control there, much like your lift master wheel would do. The last one that you touch on is something called midtone detail, and you can click and drag that up so people can see it. This is kind of the inverse of an unsharp mask in Photoshop. So it adds a nice pop to your image. A lot of times people will call this local contrast too. But all you do is just drag it. Now to reset any of these, like the midtone detail, you just double click on the name and it resets it back. Let's go on to a different clip. Let's do something like clip number 2. This is good for white balance. And we talk about white balance using initially the temperature and tint controls. Now you explain what temperature and tint are, temperature being warmer cooler adjustment and tint being the off axis. And you can kind of look at the color wheels and explain it using the color wheels, where temperature and tint are going to be this kind of axis, warmer, cooler, right, or yellow. Your off axis or your tint is going to be green and magenta. This is used often for when you have fluorescent lights. So we're going to do temperature because in our shot, we look at the shot and we can see that this shot looks very blue, and you might say that, well, there's blue in the water and in the skies, but if you look at the clouds, you can also see that these are also very blue. So we're just going to click and drag to the right to warm up this shot a little bit until the road looks less blue, right, and your clouds look more white. You're not really talking at this point about the scopes at all. You're just getting people familiar with the tools and how to move them. So don't, although it's tempting to say when you're dealing with color balance to go over to the scope and say, look at the scope. In this instance, in this lesson, we're not really dealing with the scope. We're dealing with just the tools and playing around with them. So, okay, so on this area now, what we start to move into, once we've kind of explained all of the tools around here in the lower left, we start to talk about nodes. And to do that, what we do is we come over to the 03 clip that we kind of played around with, and we talk about how nodes are kind of like color corrections, all of these color corrections that are contained in this one kind of layer on top of the image. And there are a flow graph that go from the output of the image into our first correction and then back out to the viewer. You can kind of give them it like a flow graph, if you want to explain it that way. But everything that we've done is contained in this one node. Now we may want to use multiple nodes, and you might want to give them examples of using multiple nodes. People use nodes for different reasons. Some people might want to use one node to deal with their shadows, and another deals with the highlights, and another node deals with the midtones. However people want to break it down, they can. You may end up using only one node, or you may use 10 nodes. However many is right for you. So let's do that with this clip number 3. What we might want to do is do something called secondary color correction here. So we have this node, and it deals with all of the adjustments we've made previously. But let's say we want to do something very specific, like this pole here is very bright blue, and we want to tone it down. So that is not part of the overall color correction that we did on this node. We might want to do something specific, and we might want to do it in another node. And so to add another node, what you would do is go up to Nodes and choose Add Serial Node. That adds a second node here, and you can see it's selected, highlighted orange. So any new correction that we do on this image is going to be done on this node, which is independent of the first group of color corrections. So it allows us to turn things on and off in different nodes, and we'll get to that in a bit. But right now we just have node 2 selection, and we want to isolate the color blue and tone it down. So you have different controls here in the in your toolbar, right? And right now we're looking at a curve, and Resolve has different curves. Its default is a custom curve, but it also has hue versus hue, hue versus saturation. You might want to describe what you might do with hue versus hue or hue versus sat. For us, we're going to use hue versus saturation because we want to take a hue or a color and decrease the saturation. So we're going to use hue versus saturation, and it switches our palette over to this kind of color spectrum. And we're going to just click on the blue in the pole, and when we do that, it adds a point down here in our graph. And if we drag that center point down, you'll notice that the pole becomes desaturated. The more we pull it up, it's saturated. The more we pull it down, it's desaturated. And that change is done on node 2. So if you want to do a before and after, the view bypass all grades is everything. It's both of these nodes being turned on and off when we do this. But if we just want to turn off this node right here just to see the change in the pole, we can just click the number. And that's another reason why you might want to separate different color corrections into different nodes, because it allows you to see before and after of different nodes or different color corrections that you apply to an image. Okay, so we've done that, and we were able to isolate the pole, and using a hue versus saturation do some secondary color correction here. Again, if they're not really familiar with what they did, it's not as big of a deal because we do repeat all of this in the next lesson. So we just quickly move on to another clip. We go to clip 7 here, and this clip is you can turn on loop if you want to play it.
The most wonderful machine in the world, I think.
This clip has this guy riding here, and this is a very common thing that a lot of people would like to do, which is, let's say we're not able to show this logo in this video, so we need a way to obscure it. We are going to add another node. So we're going to come up to the nodes and choose Add Serial Node. Now this one, what we're going to do is we need a way to isolate this logo. One way you can do that is what's called power windows. And power windows, if we click on it in the toolbar, give you a whole bunch of different shapes: squares, circles, lines, free drawn shapes and gradients that you can isolate parts of an image and do things with. So we're going to use this circle power window. Just by clicking on it, it will add this circle kind of mask into our image, and you can see it's here on node 2. You can see it's having the effect there. Now we're going to scale it down and reposition it right over this image. If sometimes you'll get the question, what are the different circles here? The thick circle is the mask, and then you have a gradient fall off, which are these inner and outer gradient fall off. That's controlled here in your softness down here. We can just lower that because there's really no softness on this image, so we can just bring that down to 0 and just correctly position it right over that image. Now we want to fill that or obscure that with some kind of blur or mosaic, and much like we would use the resolve effects that we did in our editing lesson, you can get to those resolve effects up here in your Open Effects library, and here they all are. They're the same ones that are found in your editing page are found here under the Open Effects in the library. And we can take something like mosaic effect, and the way you apply it here in the color page is you just drag the mosaic effect or the mosaic blur onto the node you want to add it, and we're going to add it onto the one with our power window. So now it gets added, and you can see that it's now kind of put a big blockiness within the power window. So it's not affecting the entire image, it's just affecting what's inside the power window. And we're going to increase the pixel frequency a little bit just to get that more pixelated look to it. Now the problem is, of course, we only did that on the first frame, but he's going to ride, and as he rides, now you can see it's not following that patch. So what we can do is switch over in our toolbar to the button to the right of the power window is our tracking palette. So the tracker will now track this power window as that logo moves. So all we have to do here is just click on this track forward button. And as we do it, it tracks the image. You can see it's in 3D, so it's understanding perspective and position, rotation, all of that is understood. And we can now just play this, and you can see
machine in the world, I think.
we have an obscured logo. That is this kind of quick start color correction lesson. Again, almost everything that we did here we do in the next couple of lessons. The only thing that we don't do is go into the Open Effects library. But other than that, everything else, tracking, we go into the color wheels and the palettes, and we do a lot more on the scopes. So as long as they felt a little comfortable in the window and they understand how the tools work and how to get around and a little bit about what nodes are, then that's all this lesson was meant to do. Now the next lesson, we switch projects and we go in deeper into kind of a primary grade.